And good evening to you, Armen.
Good evening to
Lots of speculation as to what the president is going to announce at 8 p.m. this evening. Many people saying another lockdown is inevitable. What are the options at this stage?
Well, essentially, the government realizes that it has to keep people working because otherwise the economy is destroyed, and then obviously Macron becomes a one-term president. So the government will have to make sure that people can still work. I think that's the key thing, and for the same reason it will probably keep schools open, though perhaps not universities. But obviously if schools were to be closed again, as they were in the first lockdown, then parents have to look after their children at home, which means that they can't go to work. So the economy takes a big hit in that situation. Work is the key, Tom. The problem is, of course, that people work at different times. So not everyone works 9 to 5. Those who do will obviously find it unpleasant to have to deal with a curfew that starts earlier than the current 9 p.m. It could be perhaps at 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. we'll see. But what about restaurateurs, bar owners, everyone who works in hospitality, artists? All those people make their livelihoods in the evening, so what's going to happen to them? But I think certainly the curfew is likely to be brought forward earlier in the day. Big question remains what happens at weekends. Will we see in the most affected, COVID-affected areas, a complete lockdown, in other words, a daytime curfew as well as a nighttime one on the weekend in the most affected areas, and perhaps lighter measures in less affected areas, either, perhaps an evening curfew only if you live in a region where there isn't much COVID. So that we may see some regional variations on the question of the weekend, which people are watching closely.
Okay, and just looking across the border to Italy, I mean, people are very angry at these new measures. There have been violent scenes in big cities in Italy. A lot of people saying, the government hasn't really got any choice but to implement these kinds of new measures. And, the French government must be thinking the same thing as we perhaps stare the prospect of a second lockdown in the face. And we heard a minister saying, this isn't going to be popular, is it?
No, definitely not. I mean, a second lockdown, even if it's slightly different, perhaps lockdown light compared to the first one, but even so, it's psychologically a lot more depressing than the first one, quite simply because it's the second one, and of course winter is coming. It's true that President Macron never ruled out a second lockdown, but I think if that is what he announces tonight, it's hard to see how his credibility doesn't suffer from that, because after all, Tom, we all remember at the end of the first lockdown, his government kept saying we're focusing on on test, trace and isolate. That system has not worked. People have been getting their test results far too late for isolation to be effective, and that's been the problem. I think the key thing Macron has to do tonight, if he does indeed announce a lockdown, a national lockdown, is how does one get out of this vicious circle? How do we avoid being in exactly the same situation a few months from now? In other words, lockdown, then lockdown is lifted, the virus starts circulating again, it's not controlled, and we go into yet another lockdown in February or March or something like that. So I think, how does one get out of this vicious circle? That's a really important question to answer tonight.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that analysis. Our international affairs editor, Armen Georgian. Thank you.
Thank you.